For going on 2.5 years now, I have regularly run into videos here on YouTube where someone wanders around a shopping center or a grocery store here in Moscow, oohing and awing at all the products on the shelves and marveling that the country isn't living in abject poverty after years of unprecedented sanctions. Now, I've largely paid these videos no mind, as most people don't understand what the sanctions are, which ones are in place, whether those people live in Russia or in Europe or even in the United States. Plus, they make for easy clickbait thumbnails. But what has gotten my attention is a new trend in videos focusing on how cheap Russia is. In part, I blame Tucker Carlson for this. His trips to Russia focused on the cost of things like groceries or fast food. Even Russian President Vladimir Putin and other politicians here like to make use of this same tactic, focusing on PPP statistics, purchasing parity power, converting prices to dollars or euros to compare them to prices abroad. And YouTube creators here in Russia have jumped on the trend, regularly going to shops or restaurants or highlighting the prices for other services and marveling at how much cheaper they are in Russia than they would be in Europe or the US. And you know what? They're absolutely right. If you come to Russia with euros or dollars, if you can reliably transfer your funds into Russia without losing 10 to 20% via commissions, hell, even losing that 10 to 20% from commissions, you'll find that your money goes much further in Russia than it does abroad. But surprise, surprise, that holds true for most developing regions. Go to Southeast Asia or Latin America or Africa, and you'll find that prices are much cheaper when converted to Western currencies. The biggest problem I have with all this is that Russians don't earn their salaries in euros or dollars. Moreover, when converted to euros or dollars, their salaries aren't anywhere near close to their Western counterparts. For this reason, using purchasing parity power, any comparison between prices in the two countries is ultimately pointless. So, is there any way to compare prices between the West and Russia? Well, obviously yes, otherwise I wouldn't be standing here today. Simply put, I figured it would make more sense to look at what percentage of a normal salary went to purchasing the necessary foodstuffs for an individual. And as for considering which foodstuffs were quote unquote necessary, I simply took the list the Russian government provided. And before anyone points out that the federal act this list was taken from was revoked in 2020, I'd like to point out that one of the reasons it was revoked was to say, optimize inflation statistics, and that realistically the amount of food that the Russian government deemed necessary for an individual probably hasn't changed much over the last 5 years, and that the amount of food necessary for a Russian to, in the eyes of the Russian government, live properly is probably okay to compare for the United States or Europe. Long story short, if it was enough 5 years ago, then I think it's safe to say that it's still enough to live on for you and I and anyone else watching this video. Plus, it might be interesting to have a look at what was or is considered a good and normal diet by the Russian government. To keep things fair, I used this same list and the same amounts for what I expect Americans to eat. I'm focused on a single working individual here because when we get into households with multiple people, whether it be a married couple or a small family or a large family or an adult taking care of one or both aged parents, there are too many variables to deal with, as well as too many government welfare programs in both countries that I simply don't know the ins and outs of. Getting back to the food, I'm going to be using the numbers for what a worker here in Moscow should eat, as that's where I live and it is easier for me to figure for. The document with the norms for all of the regions, as well as different types of people, such as children and retired folk, can be found in the description below for anyone who wishes to explore those numbers further. In the list, we can see that Moscow, part of Zone 7, have groceries broken into categories such as breads and grains, fruits and vegetables, sugars and sweets, meats, fish, dairy products, fats, spices, even tea. Some of these categories are then given more detail. With meats, for example, they have 16.5 kilograms of beef and 9.8 kilograms of pork and 31.6 kilograms of poultry for a working individual. Those numbers are for a calendar year, so to simplify things, and also because people tend to go grocery shopping a bit more frequently than once a year, I divided these figures by 12 to find the monthly norms. Next, it was time to head to the shops. While I was in the States in December, I went to the nearest grocery store and went around, recording the prices and weight or volume. I should additionally note that I simply looked for the most budget-friendly variant available in all shops, both in America and in Moscow. I realize that buying a 2-kilogram bag of flour is a larger volume than what is allotted for the month, but that's just the reality of packaging. I also didn't bother to include salt, spices, or tea in my figures, just FYI, simply because I forgot about them while I was in Iowa. So yeah, I went to Hy-Vee in Des Moines and to Dixie and Auchan in person here in Moscow, as well as checking prices on the website for Peterechka. This already presents something of a problem, as the shops I visited in Moscow are the cheapest ones around, those that most citizens have within walking distance, whereas Hy-Vee tends to be a bit nicer. To compare it to something in Moscow, I'd say it's on the level of Перекресток. Likewise, I didn't go around to other stores in the States to try and find better deals. All this is to say that the numbers I gathered up here in Moscow should be more favorable, should end up with Russia having a better result. There were also goods such as herring, which are common to the Russian diet, but which I just couldn't find in a grocery store in Des Moines, Iowa, and there's simply no accounting for that. Oh, and this shouldn't have to be said, but I will anyway. I converted all the imperial units over to metric and all the prices from dollars to rubles to make the comparison easier. All the work and the steps I did when making the conversions will be in a document that you can find in the description as well. And when we boil it down to basic numbers or rubles, the results are what you would expect. Moscow, even being one of the most expensive places in Russia, is still cheaper than Des Moines, Iowa, which, when talking about groceries, is considered to be a pretty affordable place in the United States. When choosing the cheapest options across shops in Moscow, the total expenditures for a month for an average worker is 5,471 rubles. The same amount of groceries in Des Moines came out to the equivalent of 19,299 rubles, slightly more than 3.5 times. But as I said at the start, we aren't going to be doing a triple P comparison here, as Russians do not earn their salaries in US dollars, nor are the salaries at comparable levels. Now that we know how much the items in our shopping cart cost, we have to figure out how much money do we have in our respective pockets. So, how much money do people in Moscow and Des Moines, Iowa earn? And here I was faced with the dilemma. How do I go about figuring salaries? In a city like Moscow, which has more than a few metric tons of dollar billionaires, the average tends to skew higher than the median salary, more so than in a state like Iowa, where the average and the median are relatively close, numerically speaking. Now, I would have preferred to use the median income here in Moscow, but after doing some digging around, I couldn't find it. Just again and again and again, the average salary. So we'll be using those figures, as skewed as they might be. Just consider this another advantage for Russia. That number in Moscow, according to Rosstat, was 151,623 rubles per month in October of 2024. For those interested, however, over the last year or two, a number of independent analytical groups have attempted to discover the real average salary of Muscovites by scouring headhunter websites and compiling the salaries being offered at job vacancies. The number they arrive at is significantly less, somewhere around 98,000. Still, we'll be using the official statistics. As for Des Moines, according to information from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, in 2023, the average hourly wage was $30.19. Multiply this by 40, then again by 50, taking out 2 weeks for vacation, and we get a total of $60,380. We subtract 22.1% for state and federal taxes, as well as Social Security and Medicare, and we get a total of $47,063 for the year. Divide this by 12, and we get about $3,922 per month. This is equivalent to 390,237 rubles as of making this video. Remember that number, we'll need it later. Quick aside, I need to talk about the cost of living factor, which can greatly hinder how far a salary can go. And in a city like Moscow, one would expect that to be a major hindrance. As it turns out, well, that's just not really the case. In fact, Moscow, even when adjusted for cost of living, ends up with one of, if not the highest of salaries in the country, because they are just that much larger here. Iowa, on the other hand, falls right in the middle of the pack, statistically speaking. So with this issue addressed, let's get back to the numbers, which now that I've gone over them for the cost of food and income, we can put all these parts together and come to a conclusion finally. All right, drum roll, please. For a Moscow worker, the goods at 5,471 rubles with a salary of 151,623 rubles are equal to about 3.6% of the monthly salary. When we take the Des Moines numbers, groceries equal to 19,299 rubles and a monthly income after taxes of 390,237 rubles, it works out to about 4.9% of the monthly salary. And there you have it. Muscovites do live better than Americans when it comes to food expenses. After giving the numbers here in Moscow a few different advantages, they came out ahead with Muscovites spending 1.3% less of their monthly salary on food. But I don't know if I would really count this as a win, accounting for the factors I outlined earlier. Me not shopping around for the lowest price in the States, the fact that the gap between median and average income here in Moscow is markedly larger than in Des Moines, and the cost of living versus salary issue actually being a benefit here for Moscow. I'd say that basically Des Moines, Iowa, and Moscow are kind of equal in terms of what people spend from their monthly salary in terms of food, and I might even give the advantage to Des Moines, just a slight one. Now, while it might seem like we're basically finished here, there are two issues that I can't finish this video without pointing out, and if you follow along on the channel, you'll probably understand what one of them is going to be. That is namely inflation. And while I realize that inflation has affected the price of groceries in all countries around the world, the situation in Russia here has been particularly severe the last year or so. According to official statistics from the government here, the rate of inflation last year was 9.52% after 7.42% in 2023 and 11.94% in 2022. In fact, the last time it was under 5% was in 2020. However, the price of some of the items in our cart went up much faster. Cucumbers, plus 28.5%, beets, plus 32.1%, butter, plus 36.2%, cabbage, plus 44.7%, onions, plus 48.2%, and potatoes, plus 91.9%. And although the prices of these goods are still low, those increases were noticed by the majority of people, and inflation shows no signs of slowing down. In just the first 3 weeks of 2025, it was 0.92% versus 0.86% for the whole of January last year. The other issue is more statistics, but if you've made it this far into the video, then I'm willing to bet that you can handle a few more of them. In 2024, Russians on average spent 38% of their income on food, whereas in 2022, Americans were only spending 11%. Now, for both groups, this includes money spent at restaurants or on takeout, so it's not just groceries. And while it is possible that percentages have crept higher for US citizens in the last 2 years, it still isn't anywhere near the numbers we see here in Russia. Based on statistics from both countries, even without my little experiment here, we can see that Russians spend more of their monthly budgets on feeding themselves. So the next time here on YouTube or somewhere else in the press, you see a Westerner wandering the streets of some Russian locale, singing the praises of how cheap groceries and other foodstuffs are, just remember that these people are either knowingly deceiving you, perhaps to gain views and praise from disillusioned compatriots or Russian accounts that feel so idiotic and shallow that you actually hope it's a bot typing out the drivel. Or they're speaking from a place of privilege, one in which they don't have to concern themselves with or even consider the citizens of the countries which they claim to have adopted as their new home. They don't have to think about what those citizens deal with, how they actually live. Ultimately, for the average citizen of any country in 2025, things are difficult for various reasons. Russia is no exception, so there should be no illusions regarding it. Now, I know that people will point out there are other costs associated with life, such as housing or utilities. And as I gathered up the data for this video here, as well as just keeping abreast of the situation in this country via the news, I realized that I'd be needing to do other videos on other aspects of the cost of living here in Russia versus the States. And I am going to be doing that. I'm going to be getting started on that in the near future. For now, though, if you feel the need to inform me of anything related to such matters, or if you think I made some sort of egregious error in the video and you want to inform me of that in the comments, please make sure that it's not just anecdotal evidence, but something that I can actually verify, such as an article or report or some statistics of some sort. Anecdotal evidence is ultimately, well, worthless. This is the first actual video that I've made in some time, and it took a bit of work to put everything together. So if you've found it enjoyable and or informative, it would be much appreciated if you leave a like and comment your thoughts. Subscribe if you haven't done that already. And if you know anyone else who might be interested in this video, please share it with them. And with that, I'm going to bring this one to a close. You all take care of yourselves out there. Until the next time you see me, this has been Russia in Context. Thanks for watching.